Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd just like to give a quick introduction to SER. SER is an international organization that advances the science, policy, and practice of ecological restoration. For more information and additional resources, we would encourage you to visit our website, www.ser.org. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. You'll all be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you can submit questions at any time through the chat box. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to SER's webinar library within 1 to 2 business days. With that, I would like to pass things over to the SER Rocky Mountain team.
All right, thank you, Keith. My name is Mike Curran. I'm currently the SER Rocky Mountain Chapter Outreach Director. I'll be introducing Mark Paschke here in a second, but before that, I'd like to introduce Jana Heisler-White, who is currently acting as co-chair, just to give everyone an update about what we've got going on with the Rocky Mountain Chapter here in the coming months.
Thank you, Mike. Yes. One of the things that we're starting this year, and we have Mark kicking off with his presentation, is a special series dedicated to wildfire restoration. So stay tuned. We anticipate releasing a schedule of events that will include things like webinars, potentially workshops, maybe a panel discussion, but a series of types of presentation material that we can put together primarily in lieu of the Pub Talk series that we've historically done. So we'll be sending that out probably after the first of the year and hope that, we can get a lot of participation in this as one of our major outreach and presentation efforts for this year.
All right, yeah, thanks, Jana. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Paschke. Mark is a professor and the Shell Endowed Chair of Restoration Ecology at Colorado State University. He also serves as the Research Associate Dean for the Warner College of Natural Resources at Colorado State University. He's done a lot of broad research focusing all the way from community assembly at multiple scales, from the molecular to the ecosystem level and across multiple disciplines. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in ecological restoration at Colorado State. And Mark has served many roles in professional organizations. Currently, he is our past president of the Society of Ecological Restoration Rocky Mountain Chapter, which he served as president of from April 2020, or he just finished in April 2020. So thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jana. Thanks, Keith, and thanks to SER and the SER Rocky Mountain Chapter for giving me the honor of kicking off this new webinar series. I'm honored to be able to do this, and I think the topic for today that I want to cover is very timely. All of you that live in the Rocky Mountains probably well aware that we've had a very unusual fire year on top of a very unusual fire year, which was preceded by an unusual fire year. And I think all suspicions are that that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. So I think the topic of post-fire restoration is one that we're going to be dealing with and struggling with and learning from our endeavors over the next many years. And so what I want to talk to you today about is a topic that is very special to me. It's one that I spent most of my student career studying, both for my master's and PhD work, and I've been involved a little bit with actinorhizal plants since that time, but where I really cut my teeth in research and restoration was on this topic of actinorhizal plants. And what I want to do today is specifically talk about their potential for use in restoration of post-fire ecosystems. So what I will cover today is a basic introduction for those of you who are unfamiliar with actinorhizal plants, talk a little bit about the different species of actinorhizal plants that we have here in the Rocky Mountains, talk a little bit about the Frankia symbionts of actinorhizal plants and the ecology of plants, actinorhizal plants, and then end with a bit of a presentation about utilization of these species in post-fire restoration. So actinorhizal plants, for those of you that are unfamiliar with them, are a diverse group of woody plants that form a nitrogen-fixing symbiosis with Frankia bacteria. This symbiosis is similar to that which occurs between rhizobium and plants in the legume family. but it's different in that it occurs across 3 orders of plants and 8 families and about 25 genera. And the rhizobial symbiosis, on the other hand, primarily occurs in 1 order and mainly in 1 plant family, the legume family. And so the tree over there on the right-hand side of the slide shows where nitrogen-fixing plants occur within the plant taxonomy breakdown. And you can see that the fabales, which are the legumes that are nodulated by rhizobium, are indicated there. And then there's these other 3 groups of plants that can form nitrogen-fixing symbiosis, and those 3 below the fabales are the ones that form the symbiosis with Frankia bacteria, so not to be confused with the legume rhizobium symbiosis. Most of these actinorhizal plants and their Frankia symbiosis occur in temperate regions, whereas the legumes tend to be concentrated in tropical regions. So from an ecological standpoint, that's another difference between the 2, is that the centers of diversity for these 2 groups differ a little bit geographically. And then the other big difference is actinorhizal plants are not agronomic species as the legumes are. And so because of that, we know a lot less about the background, the science underlying actinorhizal plants and their Frankia symbionts, just because they're not as economically important as the legume crop plants. So we've studied the symbiosis a lot less than the rhizobium legume symbiosis. And so the Rocky Mountains are home to 4 of the 8 known actinorhizal plant families. It's a center of diversity for actinorhizal plants in the rose family. And the Rocky Mountains are home to some of the most extensive stands of actinorhizal plants in the world. And those 2 species that form these stands are mountain mahogany and bitterbrush, so Cersocarpus montanus and Persia tridentata. They form very extensive stands in the western United States and probably some of the largest stands of actinorhizal plants in the world. So the reason why actinorhizal plants are so important in the Rocky Mountains is because they're early successional colonizing species after disturbances, and especially after fires. And so again, those of you that have choked on smoke all summer, like those of us here on the Front Range have, you're very much aware that we've had a series of very large fires this summer. 2 of the largest fires in Colorado history occurred back to back and burned up against each other this summer in Colorado and right outside of Fort Collins. This photo here is from the Cameron Peak Fire, which burned all the way from up near the Continental Divide west of Fort Collins all the way down to the foothills just outside of town. So very large fires. So the actinorhizal plants that we have here in the Rocky Mountains come from 2 of the larger groups of actinorhizal plants, and they're concentrated in these 4 actinorhizal plant families that are indicated here. There's other actinorhizal plant families that we don't have in the Rocky Mountains, such as the Casuarina family, which are the she oaks native to Australia, the Myricas, which are primarily distributed in Africa, but there are a few species in North America, just not in the Rocky Mountain region. And then the Coriariaceae and the Datiscaceae, there's 1 species of Datisca in Southern California, but no Coriaria species. So the ones that we have in Colorado, most of you are probably familiar with thin leaf alder, Ulmus incontinentifolia. It's in the birch family. It's a very common and abundant small tree or shrub in mountain riparian areas and moist understories of forest ecosystems. Very wide distribution throughout the western United States, as shown in the map here in this figure. But again, a very common species along mountain streams in the Rocky Mountains. Another is in the Iliagnaceae family, Iliagnus commutata, also known as silverberry. It's another riparian species, but less of a montane species and more of a lower elevation species, primarily in, again, riparian areas and some moist grasslands. And there's quite a bit of it in western Wyoming and up through Montana, a little bit here in Colorado, and that's about the southern end of its range. One that you're probably very familiar with is Iliagnus angustifolia, Russian olive. That's a non-native species with a very wide distribution. It was introduced intentionally in the United States, primarily as a species for reclamation, which is very good for reclaiming mineland soils, but it's also become invasive throughout most of the western United States. Very wide distribution and very wide elevation gradient. Hopefully people are not planting this anymore, but it has become very well established. But it's also the same, in the same family as some of our native Iliagnus species. So be careful if you're removing Russian olive to not mistake it for some of our other native species. And one that it often, well, the others Iliagnus species that we have in the Rocky Mountains are Shepherdia, and one of them is Shepherdia canadensis, russet buffalo berry. This is very much a mountain shrubland, chaparral, and forest understory species, occurs throughout the Rocky Mountain region. And it's one that's very prominent in the understory of forests in the Colorado and Wyoming Rocky Mountains in particular. And the one that's often confused with Russian olive is Shepherdia argentea, or silver buffalo berry. It grows in similar habitats, again, primarily riparian areas and moist hillsides, but it has a similar ecology to the invasive Russian olive, and so it could be mistaken. So you want to be careful if you're removing Russian olive, not to be removing silver buffalo berry. But again, another very important species in riparian areas, very abundant fruits that are eaten by birds, so very important for wildlife in that regard. And then there's a diverse group of plants in the Rhamnaceae family, in the Ceanothus genus. And the most prominent one in the Rocky Mountains is Ceanothus velutinus, or snowbrush ceanothus. It occurs in similar habitats as Shepherdia canadensis, understories of conifer forests, chaparral, and woodlands, especially disturbed areas. So it comes in often very thick after fires. Another one that is very prominent here in the Colorado Front Range is Ceanothus fendleri, or Fendler ceanothus. That occurs in the understory of ponderosa pine forests, and it comes in very thick after forest fires. That photo on the left side of your screen there, I took in the Buffalo Creek fire area, where this species came in very thick after that fire. Was a very dominant species for many years after that Buffalo Creek fire. It seems to really like that Pikes Peak granite, but its center of distribution is further to the south in the Four Corners area, and it's very prominent in the ponderosa pine forests in Arizona and New Mexico and southern Utah. But we do have it here in the Front Range, and it does occur up into Wyoming as well. But one that's understudied and underutilized relative to some of the other Ceanothus species that I just mentioned. Another one is Ceanothus herbaceus. This is more of a prairie species, so not very prominent, at least in the mountains, but certainly within our region. Here on the Front Range, it does occur in little bluestem prairies and open woodlands, primarily in Boulder and Larimer counties and a little bit further south. So more of a foothill species in this part of the world, and not a montane species, but one to be aware of. Another that's not really a Rocky Mountain species, but on the very tip of the southern end of the Rockies, it does occur in New Mexico, Ceanothus integrimus, deer brush. It's a very prominent species in mountain shrublands, disturbed fir forests, and ponderosa pine understories. And another one, as evidenced by this photo, that comes in very thick after fires in this region. A lot more prominence in California. And then one that we have here in Colorado and also in Wyoming is Ceanothus martinii over on the west slope of the Rocky Mountains. It's more of a disturbed open conifer forest type of species and shrubland species. It's more of a low-growing shrub relative to some of the others. That is Martin Ceanothus, Ceanothus martinii. Another is Ceanothus sanguineus, which occurs further north in the northern Rocky Mountains in Montana and Idaho. Red stem Ceanothus occurs in disturbed, dry, open forests. And again, it also comes in quite prominently after wildfires in this part of the Rocky Mountains. And then there's the rose family, which we have a few members of in the Rocky Mountains, and one of those is Sirsocarpus montanus, referred to often as just mountain mahogany or alderleaf mountain mahogany. And this is a species with wide distribution in chaparral, mesas, and pine understories. Tends to occupy lower elevations, as this photo here indicates in the foothills just outside of Fort Collins, where it forms very extensive and fairly dominant stands. And these stands extend all the way up and down the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains from New Mexico all the way up into Montana and Canada as well. So this is one of those very widely distributed actinorhizal shrubs. And another on the west side of the mountain ranges is Cersocarpus Lodofolius, also up in Wyoming as well. Very similar in ecology to alderleaf mountain mahogany, but occurs in drier habitats on the west side of the mountains. It's one that in further west in California and Utah can actually form fairly large plants, might be characterized more as a small tree in some of those areas. And then there's Sirsocarpus Intracatus, our little leaf mountain mahogany. It's more of a canyon land type of species, but occurs in pinyon juniper and ponderosa woodlands, dry areas on the west slope of the Rockies, but similar ecology to the other Sirsocarpus species. And then we have a couple of species of rosaceous actinorhizal shrubs that grow in tundra environments. And one of those is Dryas drummondii in the northern Rockies, or Drummond's mountain avens is a common name. Again, Arctic and alpine tundras, and especially areas that have been disturbed. And then further south in the Rockies, we have Dryas octopetala, or 8-leaf mountain avens, again occurring in disturbed Arctic and alpine tundra. And then one of the most common actinorhizal plants in the Western United States is in the rose family as well, and that's Persea tridentata, antelope bitterbrush. And this occurs in dry open woodlands, chaparral, sagebrush shrublands, and mixed conifer understories. So a very broad ecological amplitude. This species alone occupies, it's been estimated at 136 million hectares in 11 Western states. So certainly one of the more widely distributed and more abundant actinorhizal plants in the world. So those are the main species of actinorhizal plants that we have in the Rocky Mountains. There's a few more that are minor, and I'm not going to cover those but that just gives you an idea, hopefully, of the breadth of actinorhizal species that we have. And again, what makes actinorhizal species unique is this ability to form a symbiosis with nitrogen-fixing Frankia bacteria. And Frankia are very common soil actinomycetes. They're saprophytic. They can grow off organic matter in the soil, so they can occur outside of root nodules, but what we really regard them highly for is their ability to form these nitrogen-fixing root nodules in association with actinorhizal plants. And again, they're similar to rhizobium and legumes, but we know very little about Frankia relative to rhizobia. And part of the reason is Frankia were not cultured until the late 1970s. And so the ability to study Frankia for a very long period of time was hampered by people's inability to culture the organism in pure cultures and be able to study it using standard microbiology techniques. It was just a real difficult task to get it to grow in pure culture, and primarily because it's a very slow growing organism, and slow growing microbes were very difficult to culture during this time period, whereas rhizobium was a faster growing bacteria, so it was cultured early on and studied quite extensively. And again, there's the issue of Frankia just not being as a grade of interest because it was not associated with crop plants the way rhizobium were. It's also important to note that most of these actinorhizal plants are mycorrhizal, and people often confuse mycorrhizae with rhizobium or Frankia, but mycorrhizae are a fungi and Frankia and rhizobium are a bacteria. And most of these actinorhizal plants can form associations with not just Frankia that can fix nitrogen, but also with mycorrhizae that can help with water and mineral uptake. And interestingly, actinorhizal plants such as Persia and Cersocarpus have the ability to form associations with Frankia, but also vesicular or buscular mycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae at the same time. So they're very promiscuous in terms of the types of organisms that they allow to form associations in their root systems. And this gives them kind of a leg up in terms of nodulation and nitrogen fixation, because those benefits that are afforded by the mycorrhizae can lead to increased nodulation and nitrogen fixation by Frankia. So in terms of the impact of that nitrogen fixation on Rocky Mountain ecosystems, we know actually very little about how much nitrogen is being contributed. But we do know that these plants can add significant amounts of nitrogen to disturbed systems through leaf litter and root turnover. And there has been some work done, for example, by Dan Binkley in the Pacific Northwest, looking at Ulmus rubra, where that study found that Ulmus rubra can add between 50 and 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And if those numbers don't mean anything to you, just take my word for it. That's a lot of nitrogen, especially at that higher level. Ceanothus sanguineus, that red stem Ceanothus, has been studied in British Columbia and by Binkley and Husted. And in that case, they found that that species was adding between 24 and 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Other actinorhizal shrubs are likely adding between 1 and 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And those are sort of rough estimates based on a limited number of studies. And again, most of the studies that have looked at rates of fixation in actinorhizal plants have occurred in places other than the Rocky Mountains, such as the Pacific Northwest, and in many cases in California, looking at things like the Ceanothus species. So very little work has been done on studying the amount of nitrogen that's added to Rocky Mountain ecosystems by these actinorhizal species. There was some work done by Zoe Miller back in 2011 looking at Schippertia canadensis, where she found that between 75 and 95% of the nitrogen that was contained in that plant bore the signature of being coming from fixation by Frankia. So that's an indication that that buffalo berry, that's a common plant in the understory of forests in the Rocky Mountains, is deriving most of its nitrogen from fixation by Frankia, as opposed to uptake from the soil, similar to the path that other plants would take. So that's a potentially significant amount of nitrogen that's being added to these Rocky Mountain ecosystems. It's important to note also that the low numbers that have been observed for Rocky Mountain ecosystems, such as 1 to 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, may seem very small compared to that 50 to 200 in the Pacific Northwest. But remember, these are primarily semi-arid ecosystems where ecosystem productivity is much lower than those forests in the Pacific Northwest. So on a pure percentage basis of the nitrogen that's being derived from fixation, it's probably fairly significant in the Rocky Mountains, even though the numbers are somewhat smaller than places like the Pacific Northwest. But again, this is mostly speculation because people have not really studied this very much, and that's largely because it's very difficult to study and to determine the rates and the amounts of nitrogen that are added by these symbiosis. But we do know that nitrogen fixation can be especially important after fires when the vegetation's been removed and where topsoil might have been lost from erosion, and nitrogen may have been lost from the ecosystem. And not only nitrogen, but carbon as well. And so nitrogen fixing plants in general can be really important after fires, and in the Rocky Mountains, actinorhizal plants certainly are important. As this picture here illustrates, the abundance that actinorhizal plants can occur in after wildfires. This is Ceanothus velutinus coming in very thick after this wildfire in western Montana. So we do know that actinorhizal plants add nitrogen, but they also add a lot of carbon to the ecosystem. So just by their ability to colonize these often barren substrates, because they can fix nitrogen, that also allows them to colonize these disturbed areas and start to add carbon to that soil. And that buildup of organic matter and carbon and nitrogen create favorable conditions for other species. So it's not just the nitrogen that they're adding, it's their ability to photosynthesize in these areas and add carbon to the system as well. These species are also very attractive to herbivores and pollinators, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the reason that's important in terms of succession and facilitation of plant communities is because by attracting those other animals to the ecosystem, they're increasing indirectly things like seed rain from those animals that might be bringing seeds into the system. So those birds that are going to eat the seeds of those buffalo berry shrubs that are growing in these disturbed sites could be bringing seeds of other species with them and defecating those into the understory of those shrubs, and therefore helping to establish other species around those shrubs. And it's not just seeds, it's spores and bacteria and other things that those critters are moving into the environment really helps facilitate succession of plant communities. And it's also been shown in other parts of the world and speculated here in the Rocky Mountains that those alders that grow in those mountain stream communities could be very important for the nitrogen economy of those stream ecosystems. An interesting feature of many actinorhizal species, and including alders, is that because they have such an abundant supply of nitrogen from fixation by Frankia and root nodules, they're kind of lazy with their nitrogen in the fall, and rather than retranslocating that nitrogen out of their leaves and into their roots and stems, the way many other plant species do, they tend to retranslocate much less of that nitrogen. And what you often see in Rocky Mountain streams in the fall, as this picture here shows, is those alders will drop their leaves green as opposed to turning yellow or other colors because they're not really taking the nitrogen out of those leaves and breaking it down in the fall. They're just being lazy and dropping that because they have an abundant supply of it readily available in their nodules for the next year. And so this results in input of nitrogen to these stream ecosystems, and that's been shown especially with other alder species in California and in Europe to be an important source of nitrogen for those benthic organisms, those macroinvertebrates in those stream ecosystems, and therefore on up the food chain to fish and other higher trophic groups as well. So a lot of these Rocky Mountain actinorhizal plants, things like Persia, Shepherdii, and Ceanothus, are they're often early successional shrubs after fires, but they can persist as mid or late seral components of shrubs, shrublands, or woodlands. And one of the interesting features of these species is that people have often wondered, well, what's the benefit of being a nitrogen fixer in these later seral environments? And certainly ecologists have understood for a long time the importance of being a nitrogen fixer in an early seral environment because nitrogen is lacking, but why they persist in mid and late successional systems is a little bit puzzling. And that's especially prominent in these Rocky Mountain shrub species, unlike other nitrogen fixing woody plants in other parts of the world. And one reason this might be the case has to do with wildlife. And a lot of wildlife in the Rocky Mountains are very dependent upon these nitrogen fixing actinorhizal plants. For example, mule deer in Utah have been observed to have their diet composed of about 8% bitterbrush in May, which increases throughout the summer to about 92% of their diet is composed of bitterbrush in September. And that was from the study by Austin and Ernest in 1983. Similarly, 74 to 92% of the summer diet of bighorn sheep in the Front Range of Colorado has been shown to be comprised of mahogany leaves. So certainly two species that are very important for wildlife in the Rocky Mountains. And then in Idaho, it's been observed that 25 to 85% of the annual production of that red stem Ceanothus and 68 to 80% of Ceanothus velutinus were consumed by elk every year. So these wildlife species are utilizing these actinorhizal plants quite extensively. And that's because these plants have a very high protein content because they have such an abundant supply of nitrogen. They have a high level of protein in their tissue, which makes them very attractive to these herbivores. And that could be a reason why the nitrogen fixing symbiosis is important to these plants, not just for their ability to colonize disturbed sites that lack nitrogen, but it might also be a way to compensate for that loss of nitrogen that occurs from the intense herbivory that these plants experience from these native herbivores. These plants are also important for insects, and this has, of course, been a point of interest in recent years with declines in pollinator species. There's much more attention to plant species that are beneficial to the pollinator species. And these actinorhizal plants are certainly high in that category. And again, that's because the abundant supply of nitrogen that these plants have allows them to have very rich nectaries that are important for pollinator species. as well as the birds and other animals that might eat those insects that are attracted to and benefit from those actinorhizal plants that support those insect communities. So again, another important reason or important component of the ecology of these actinorhizal shrubs is their benefits for pollinators. So some other things that are important to keep in mind in terms of actinorhizal plants and their interactions with post-fire environments. Ceanothus species, those snowbrush and red stem ceanothus and those other ceanothus species are able to persist for very long times as seeds in soil and germinate after fire. Most ceanothus species need some sort of heat to break their dormancy of their seeds. And so you have seed banks that persist for very long times. I believe Ceanothus velutinus seed has been shown to persist in seed banks in the Pacific Northwest for many centuries. And so those species can sit in that soil and wait for a fire to come through and then germinate and grow a very long time after the parent plants may have left that site. But a lot of Ceanothus species can also resprout after fires, but it depends on the condition of the fire, the intensity, and the moisture content of the soil. But these are species that can readily germinate from persistent seed banks. Bitterbrush also responds to fire, but in very different ways. Some studies have indicated that it comes in very well after fires, and others not so well at all. And it appears that it is very site-specific and dependent upon the fire, the aspect, the condition of the plants, the moisture content of the soil the year after the fire. So very conditional response of Persia after fire. And a lot of the emergence from seed within Persia may be dependent upon collection and seed caching by rodents. We know that even in the absence of fire, that rodents play a very important role in establishment of Persia from seed. And so after a fire, those seed caches that are in the soil may be an important source of establishment of Persia plants after fire. An important thing to keep in mind is that because these plants are so attractive to herbivores, deer and elk and bighorn sheep, their establishment and ecology in the system after a fire can be highly regulated by those herbivore species. And so in areas where you have a high population of deer and elk, you might see fewer of these actinorhizal plants coming in after a fire, especially if those herbivore populations have lost a great extent of their food sources. They might key in on these actinorhizal plants because of their high protein content, and that could drive these species out of the ecosystem. So interactions with herbivores become very important. So let's switch gears and talk about utilization in post-fire restoration of these species. I created a table here just to give a quick summary of some of the actinorhizal species we have in the Rocky Mountains and whether the seed is readily available, whether nursery stock is readily available. And this is just a very quick analysis. It's by no means complete. It's quite likely that some of these species that I don't show seed availability for, you could find them in the open market, but this table simply illustrates, generally whether these species are readily available or not as seed or nursery stock. And you can see that many of these species do have seed and nursery stock that's readily available, but some, such as Fendler Ceanothus, which we know is really important for post-fire recovery here in the Front Range of Colorado, it's difficult or impossible to find seed or nursery stock of that species. So I think this is an area where we as a restoration community might be able to really make a difference is helping to promote the use and the the culture of these species for use and restoration. Continuing on, here's the same table for the rosaceous actinorhizal species. And again, you see for the really important Sirsocarpus montanus, seed is readily available, as is nursery stock. But some of these other species, much less so. And bitterbrush as well, readily available seed and nursery stock. One thing that's often a point of confusion or concern is the ability or the lack of nodules on nursery stock, or the need to inoculate nursery stock with Frankia bacteria to get that symbiosis going. And in many cases, nursery stock may lack Frankia root nodules, depending on the type of soil that it's grown in. And we certainly know from research that inoculation of the stock prior to planting can greatly increase the survivability of those plantings. Unfortunately, there are no commercial sources of Frankia inoculum, as there are for Rhizobium inoculum on legumes. And we also know very little about host specificity groups within Frankia and Rocky Mountain actinorhizal plants. But a good thing is that it's easy to form root nodules on actinorhizal plants simply by inoculating them with field soil that's collected from underneath one of a similar actinorhizal species. So if you're growing mountain mahogany in a greenhouse for a restoration, you can simply go out and collect a little bit of soil from underneath an existing mahogany stand and inoculate it onto those plants. And there's a really good chance that you'll form good, effective root nodules on that nursery stock. And again, that can greatly increase the chances of survival of those seedlings when they're planted out in the field. So something that you should be doing if you're growing these plants for a restoration setting. And it's important to note, again, these species are mycorrhizal. So nursery stock that's inoculated with Frankia and mycorrhizae from a native soil source will greatly improve success as well. So by using soil inoculum, you're inoculating with both the Frankia and the mycorrhizae, and you're going to have often much better success with plantings. So inoculating the nursery stock is something that's easy to do and should almost always be done when you're planting actinorhizal plants. When you're growing these species from seed in a restoration setting, you don't need to worry about inoculation, because typically that Frankia bacteria will be there in the soil, or will get there through dispersal, and so much less of a concern to inoculate with Frankia when you're doing a seeding. So let me wrap it up there and then take some questions. So for conclusions, hopefully you've got the idea that Rocky Mountain actinorhizal shrubs are really keystone species in post-fire recovery. Restoration of these burned areas can be facilitated by seeding or planting actinorhizal species. So they're species that we ought to be considering extensively as we look to restore these burned areas. And restoration in general would benefit from more commercial sources of actinorhizal seeds and nursery stock. So if you're a seed company or a nursery manager, getting these species into production would really help the restoration community if it's at all possible. And it's important to keep in mind that these shrubs are really important for wildlife population. So as we look to restore these vast areas of forest fires that have lost vegetative cover, we need to be thinking about the wildlife that are dependent upon these ecosystems, and the importance of actinorhizal plants in those ecosystems for those wildlife becomes really important. But also we need to think about the level of browsing that occurs from those wildlife on those actinorhizal plants, and the potential for overbrowsing to reduce or eliminate actinorhizal plants from the ecosystem, which could greatly slow down successional recovery of these post-fire environments. So wildlife management may be a key to restoration of these ecosystems via their interaction with these actinorhizal plants. So with that, I will stop talking, and hopefully we have plenty of time to have some questions and discussion.
All right, thanks, Mark. We do have time for a few questions, so if you have a question, now is the time to submit it. We'll start with a question about the relationship between nitrogen and species invasion. So in a prior SCR workshop, we discussed the relationship between excessive nitrogen dumping as a pathway to increase invasion. Is there a relationship between these actinorhizal species and the addition of nitrogen by these species and invasion by non-native species, Mark?
Yeah, there has been some linkages that have been made with, for example, mountain mahogany and bitterbrush and the occurrence of cheatgrass, which is one of those invasive species that seems to thrive in high nitrogen environments. The good news is that these actinorhizal plants are adding nitrogen in the form of organic nitrogen, and so that's much less of a pulse of inorganic nitrogen that those nitrophilic plants like cheatgrass really like. And so adding nitrogen with inorganic nitrogen fertilizer is a way to get a lot of cheatgrass. Adding nitrogen with nitrogen-rich organic matter is less of a concern in many cases, because it takes a while for that nitrogen to break down and form that pulse of inorganic nitrogen that those cheatgrass and other weeds like. So yes, you can increase things like cheatgrass in the understory of bitterbrush and mountain mahogany through that process of nitrogen fixation and eventual mineralization of that nitrogen, but it's a fairly slow and steady buildup of nitrogen that the cheatgrass doesn't seem to respond to as much as, say, fertilizing with nitrogen would.
Excellent. So we have a couple questions about the relationship between severe fires and Frankia species. Is there a relationship between the severity of fire and the ability of these species to survive, or are we seeing fires that may be getting too hot for germination? Is there an upper limit to that?
Certainly in terms of the plant species, we see fires that are too intense for, resprouting of these actinorhizal shrubs, and therefore you have to have recolonization from outside by seed sources. And there's a spectrum of that, obviously, and a lot of it depends in the answer. In terms of Frankia, we know a lot less about the ecology and biology of Frankia and soil, simply because it's so hard to study and the tools have not been available until very recently. And so whether or not severe fires would eliminate Frankia from a site is largely an unknown, but we can speculate a little bit about that. We know that Frankia form spores, and those spores seem to be very, very tough in terms of their ability to withstand desiccation and high heat and other forms of torture that people have put them through in a laboratory environment. So it's probably, we can speculate probably that in many cases the Frankia bacteria themselves would survive that fire as long as they're in a spore form in the soil. And we also know that Frankia do move around in the environment quite readily, primarily through biological vectors such as birds. And so it's probably not that big of a concern to worry about Frankia being eliminated from the environment in a hot fire. I'd be more concerned about the plants, the actinorhizal plants being eliminated.
Right. Is there a reason why Frankia seems to prefer woody plants over other types of plants?
It's just it had that symbiosis is not evolved in annual plants or non-woody plants. for the most part. All actinorhizal plants are nearly all woody plants. The one exception is there's a couple species in the Datisca family, which are characterized as herbaceous plants, although those plants have a woody rootstock. So that perennial woody feature seems to be important, and that's where the symbiosis has evolved, unlike the rhizobium symbiosis, which does occur in some annual and biennial plant species.
Okay, moving on to more application questions. Do you have any advice for how to incorporate these species best in a restoration project? Would you recommend seeding over planting, or what types of introduction are best?
Well, the best is always planting of nursery stock, because you get greater success that way, but the costs are extremely prohibitive, especially when we're talking about large acreages. As you know, these recent fires, when they're burning hundreds of thousands of acres, replanting is off the table simply because of the economics and the lack of that many plants to plant in those areas. So that brings us back to seed. Most of these actinorhizal plants can be established from seed. Most people often shy away from that simply because the seed is expensive, and shrub seed relative to grass seed is very expensive. So post-fire seeding operations tend to focus mostly on very inexpensive grass species, just because of the economics. I would argue that there's no reason not to include things like actinorhizal shrubs in a seed mix, even if they are very expensive. You can dial down the seeding rate of those species to just a few seeds per acre or whatever, and at least you're giving that plant a possibility to establish in that ecosystem by seeding at a very low rate. And the other important feature is dialing down the grasses in a seed mix, because grasses will outcompete shrubs in nearly all the time. So in many cases, when we're doing post-fire seeding, if we're trying to promote the long-term successional development of the ecosystem, we might be being counterproductive by overseeding grasses and not including enough shrubs like these actinorhizal shrubs that will be choked out and eliminated by that grass competition. So we have to, evaluate these trade-offs between that desire to get a cover on a site after a fire to reduce erosion and avoid the, catastrophes of soil erosion and mass wasting. And we do that by planting grass versus the long-term goals of planting shrubs and trees, which are a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to pull off than seeding grasses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you say that by dialing down those species, you would protect, I guess, the long-term viability of your restoration project?
As long as you're including these slower growing perennial shrub species, you would increase their ability to establish by reducing competition with grasses in the seed mix. So by dialing down grass competition, you're going to increase the abundance of native forbs and native shrubs in a post-fire seeding.
Excellent. Our next question is, what is the life expectancy of Frankia in storage, and what's the best way to store field soil containment?
Because it forms spores, it can live very long periods in the soil. How long is anybody's guess? I did some experiments when I was a graduate student looking at soil that had been sealed in jars for over 100 years and was able to find Frankia in that soil. So I suspect that in many cases, Frankia spores can survive very long time periods in soil. And because it can be dispersed widely in the environment by birds and other vectors, there's probably always some spores laying around in the soil that are ready to go or soon to be ready to go.
Do you have any tips for collecting seeds of actinorhizal plants?
Number one, get permission first from whatever landowner or agency you're collecting, and then follow, the standard seed collection protocols in terms of the ethics of not over collecting from any one stand or any one individual plant, and collecting local ecotypes is always best in terms of restoration success. Those are the important considerations, I think. But most of these species produce fairly abundant seed crops, but they have to be collected by hand.
Excellent. All right. So we're coming up to the hour here. So thank you very much, Mark.
Yep.
For anyone who still has questions, is there an email address where they could contact you to follow up?
Yeah, mark.paschke@colostate.edu.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. And thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. The recording will be uploaded within the next 2 business days. It will be left as open access for anyone who would like to rewatch it or share the webinar. You will also receive a follow-up email with a certificate of completion for those who need it and a quick survey. Please take the time to fill out this survey. We use the feedback to guide our webinar program. I once again encourage everyone to visit our website, www.ser.org, for more resources and to learn about the benefits of SER membership. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, Mark, or your colleagues?
Thanks to SER Rocky Mountain, and thanks to SER as well. And hopefully we'll see a lot of people back for the next installment of this session.
Awesome. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone an excellent rest of your day. Thanks, bye.
Bye.